Welcome back, everybody, to our lessons where we explore the philosophy of existentialism. We've been spending some time looking at Kierkegaard in the last few lessons, talking about the various different philosophical contributions he made in relation to and through the lens of this idea of existentialism. This next series of lessons is going to focus on an individual who is far more famous on the one hand, but is also another contributor to a number of different conversations within existentialism, this being Friedrich Nietzsche. We're going to explore and take an introduction to Friedrich Nietzsche in this lesson, and then we're going to look at the various different contributions he has made to philosophy over the next few lessons. Ultimately, the purpose of this is to explore Nietzschean philosophy through the lens of existentialism, or as an idea that extends out of existentialism, rather than just looking at Nietzschean philosophy holistically as a philosophical tradition in and of itself. So we might in the future come to looking at Nietzsche in far more detail, maybe in a Great Minds in Philosophy series. But for now, we're going to explore some of the contributions he made that are existential in nature. So we're going to talk about things like nihilism, the relationship with religion, as well as the ways in which Nietzsche contributed to moral philosophy, or in his view, immoral philosophy. So this is the next of our major existential philosophers, that being Friedrich Nietzsche. We've also got a number of others that we're going to explore in the future, people like Heidegger, for example, Albert Camus, and Jean-Paul Sartre. We're going to spend some time looking at his philosophy over this lesson and the next few lessons. Essentially, we will talk about nihilism as a philosophical tradition. We'll talk about what it means to be a nihilist within philosophy. We'll talk about how Nietzsche contributes to the idea of nihilism, but not in a way as to suggest that he is a nihilist, because he actually wasn't nihilistic in his outlook. He was nihilistic in his outlook. His philosophy was nihilistic potentially in his outlook, but he himself was not a nihilist. He himself was talking about and looking to describe the world as he saw it, and that was, of course, through this idea of nihilism. We'll talk about Nietzsche moral positions. We'll also talk about things looking at free will as well, and determinism. So this lesson and the rest of this lesson is just going to be spent looking at the life of Nietzsche in a little bit more detail. The reason why this is important is because we can examine his contributions to philosophy through the time period and in the lens of which he was writing. Of course, the way in which we understand philosophy is, of course, from as is its historical development, as well as its core fundamental ideas. So Nietzsche himself, Friedrich Nietzsche himself, was a German philosopher who was born in 1844 and would die at the turn of the century in 1900. He is well known for his influence and contributions to continental philosophy. Continental philosophy being a broad tradition of philosophy that sort of exists in this period of time. It's quite a bit longer than, of course, the lifetime of Nietzsche himself, but is sort of balanced against and contrasted with the sort of analytical traditions of philosophy that we see in other areas of the world. Now, so therefore, we see that Nietzsche contributes to this and is well discussed within the view of continental philosophy. If you were to take any kind of continental philosophy course, you would study Nietzsche at some point. Ultimately, he contributes as well to a broader tradition of existentialism, ethical theory, and political theory. As we've noted in previous lessons, when we began looking at existentialism, the idea of existentialism isn't necessarily as a movement that was defined by the people themselves, but was sort of defined by their particular works. And so we can sort of, at post hoc, look back to see who were considered to be that of the existentialists within this sort of new contemporary set of philosophical traditions. He's also arguably one of the most early proponents of what we would today call postmodernism. He is something of a postmodernist. We're not going to get into postmodernism in too much detail in these lessons, although there is something of an interrelation, at least in terms of the philosophers who you would examine, between that of the postmodernists and that of the existentialists. Indeed, as well, many philosophers would consider the works of Nietzsche and Nietzsche's philosophy himself to sort of mark the end of a period of classical philosophy, or maybe even early modern philosophy, and towards that of contemporary philosophy. Obviously, contemporary philosophy is characterized most prominently as the philosophy of the 20th century and all the way to the present day, there or thereabouts. And so Nietzsche, having died in 1900 and contributing his writings towards the end of the 1800s, of course contributes to this transition into contemporary philosophical thought. I also want to talk about one of his early influences as well. We will talk about other influences that Nietzsche would have over the course of the next few lessons as we come to looking at those particular individuals. But I want to talk about Arthur Schopenhauer, and ultimately Nietzsche himself would study in the 1860s the works of Arthur Schopenhauer, and ultimately what Schopenhauer's philosophy really is interesting for is his contributions to the continental traditions. We talk about Schopenhauer in relation to that of individuals such as Karl Marx, as well as Hegel. And so ultimately he was a philosopher who was born in 1788. He would die in 1860, so he would sort of contribute to philosophy at a period just before that of Nietzsche. And he is best known for his work, The World as Will and Representation. Here he would build on the ideas of theoreticians and philosophers of people like Immanuel Kant, specifically drawing into Kantian metaphysics and talking about things such as transcendental idealism, which is a set of theories that we're going to get to in far more detail when we look at Immanuel Kant, when we do the next series of The Great Minds in Philosophy, which is coming out in and around the beginning of September. Thanks, by the way, for everyone who voted for Immanuel Kant. I've been very much enjoying reading Immanuel Kant. That was sarcasm. But ultimately, the concept of transcendental idealism and ultimately pronounce a rejection of what Schopenhauer would be contributing to, which is this idea of the broader German idealism movement. So German idealism was something that was developing all around people like Schopenhauer, and he would actually reject this view. His work as well would ultimately contribute to some of the most influential ideas within metaphysics and epistemology. So in his work he argues, for example, that the phenomenal world is the product of blind nominal will. So what do these things mean? Ultimately, phenomenal just means observable, the observable world. When we think about phenomenology and the phenomenal world, we're talking about that which is observable through senses, and nominal means that is a type of knowledge that we're talking about, which is viewed as an object which exists independently of the human self. So if we can essentially take those words and or those definitions and put them back into that sentence, he argues in his work that the observable world is the product of a blind type of knowledge as an object which exists independently of human sense and the will of that particular type of knowledge. So Schopenhauer is a very interesting character. Some of these ideas we're going to come back to when we look at how Nietzsche applies them, or at least is influenced by them in future lessons' time. Of course, we're not going to divulge into too much detail about Arthur Schopenhauer in this particular series of lessons, because this is a series of lessons on existentialism. So we'll get to that in future, but for now we will start to think about in the next lesson the philosophy of nihilism and talk about how nihilistic philosophy can contribute to and intersect with the ideas of existentialism.